Well, thank you everybody for coming today. This is wonderful. If you haven't had a chance to grab some refreshments, feel free. This is just the not presenting guy talking, so no worries if you need to grab your last cup of coffee or a cookie. My name is Israel Haas. I'm the Executive Director for the Great River Road Visitor and Learning Center, and we are super excited to partner with Margaret Smith. I'm going to be introducing in just a minute here from the Trumpeter Swan Society, which is why you're here. And I just want to thank you, though, for flexing with us this week. So when we first originally set this up, we thought, oh, we'll have a nice little 20 or 30 people in our little multi-purpose room at the visitor center. And, well, we were surprised by how many people were interested. We unfortunately had to cap it today at 140, but all of you made it here. So thank you for letting us start a little late. We wanted to give folks a chance who hadn't heard the message about the change of venue to get here, so thank you for that. We appreciate it. And wanted to share a little bit about the Great River Road Visitor and Learning Center. We've been in existence for about 16 years now, and 14 years now, and I am the newest executive director, just started last fall, and so this is really kind of my first event. So really super excited that you guys have made it here for this. If you didn't have a chance to pick up our newsletter, this is the most recent newsletter. It tells you a little bit about what we had done last year and where we're going. We also have a number of similar programs, not necessarily this large, that will be happening in the weeks to come. We have all of that information on our Facebook site and our website. And also, if you like paper, we do have some paper copies here at the front table. So my stuff's at the front, and the super exciting stuff about swans is at the back, okay? But if you want to pick up that, we have a couple of things coming up, including a bluebird conservation workshop. We have our Confluence Symposium for those of you who are here in the St. Croix Valley. Really great opportunity to come together about our topic, sustainability in the confluence, looking at it from the perspective of the public space, the private space, the personal space. And we will be meeting in River Falls on March 10. More information about that on our Facebook site as well. Connect with us there, Great River Road Visitor and Learning Center. I know it's a mouthful, but just search it, Great River Road, and it'll probably pop right up for you. We also have something that is not on the list here, but if you like birds, which you probably do since you're here, we are hosting another event in April 15th. That'll be during the week. We're partnering with a school system. We'll have capacity for over 500 people, and we'll have the Raptor Center bring 4 of their birds and give you a chance to interact with those birds as well. So excited about that. But before we start our program, also want to thank Patax for, at the last minute, letting us set up in this location. So a big hand to Mike Patak and the Patax organization. Us. So we would be really tight trying to cramp into the visitor center. And afterwards, if you haven't been to our visitor center, take a drive down. You'll be able to see the confluence, maybe even see some trumpeter swans from our location at Freedom Park. It's in a mile and a half, just that way. As the swan flies, and yeah, I know, lame joke. But it's a great, beautiful area where at the confluence, where you can see not only our history in our exhibits in our visitor center, but also just a gorgeous view of 2 rivers, great rivers, coming together right underneath our bluff. So without further ado, Margaret Smith, thank you for joining us from the Trumpeter Swan Society. I'll let her introduce herself and her organization, and we're super excited. Big hand of applause for Margaret, please.
Thank you. Well, gosh, it's great to be here. I used to work here in Prescott. Actually, I was the executive director at the Great River Road Visitor and Learning Center. Now I'm the executive director of the Trumpeter Swan Society. And today, I'm going to be talking about the return of the trumpeter swan, bringing a species back from the brink of extinction. Now, how many of you here have actually seen a trumpeter swan? Wow, okay, that's great. All right. Well, some of you may know or may not know the story of the return of the trumpeter swan to Wisconsin and to Minnesota, but I'm actually also going to talk to you about the return of the swan to North America, because it's a North American story. Minnesota and Wisconsin stories fit into that bigger story. So, once upon a time, in North America, trumpeter swans nested throughout the northern part of North America. So this was done in the 1960s by a very famous person named Winston Bacall. And these were trade records of trumpeter swan skins that were shipped to market. With the arrival of the Europeans came the fur trade. And for swans, probably the most important fur trade company was the Hudson Bay trading posts. And all those little red dots are actually Hudson Bay fur trading post sites. Well, trumpeters were hunted for food, skins, and feathers. And so really by the 1880s, they were virtually gone from the continental United States. They disappeared. But in the early 1930s, Yellowstone National Park had done a survey, and they did find 69 swans in the remote areas of Yellowstone National Park and just to the west of that. So for many years, it was thought that there were only 69 trumpeter swans left in North America. Because they were found in that area, the federal government in 1935 established Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. Now, many of you know about national parks, and you know that those are for recreation and also for wildlife. National wildlife refuges are also federal lands, and they're your lands, and generally those are set up for wildlife. So here's Yellowstone National Park, here's the Tetons, here's Red Rock Lakes right here. It's very remote. You still can only get there by gravel road. It's very likely you'll get a flat tire if you go in there because it's pretty rough. It's very remote, and that's still the most important nesting site for trumpeter swans in the western United States. Well, later, more trumpeter swans were found in Canada, in the Grand Prairie, Alberta region. And then in the 1950s, additional populations were found in the remote areas of Alaska. So by the time 1968 came around, there were about almost 2,000 trumpeter swans. Most of them were in the Alaska-Yukon region. Well, going back to the 1930s, there was a lot of concern that these trumpeter swans were going to die out, just kind of wink out, if they were still only in the one place at Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. So in the 30s and 40s, the US government, the Fish and Wildlife Service, transferred trumpeter swans to other national wildlife refuges. And these we call legacy flocks. Let me do that. So Red Rock Lakes is somewhere in here. So Turnbull is in eastern Washington state. Malheur is in Oregon. Ruby Lake is down in Nevada. And so in the 30s and 40s, they got the original legacy flocks. And in the 1960s, La Creek National Wildlife Refuge in South Dakota also got some as well. So Red Rock Lakes really played an important role in the comeback of the trumpeter swan. And even in the Midwest restoration programs, originally, Hennepin County Parks went to Red Rock Lakes to get cygnets and trumpeter swans to begin a program here in Minnesota, although we're in Wisconsin. And actually, the guy that went to Red Rock Lakes to get those swans is here today. So Dave, you want to? David Williams. So thanks, Dave, for, yeah. At the same time, zoos in the 1960s also got trumpeter swan eggs and cygnets because, again, there was concern that these birds were going to wink out. And zoos have continued to play a very important role in the conservation of trumpeter swans and other species as well. Well, we know that in the 1930s, trumpeter swans were found at just one National Wildlife Refuge, and that was Red Rock Lakes. As of today, with restoration efforts, they're now found at more than 68 National Wildlife Refuges. So quite a remarkable comeback. Well, how were trumpeter swans restored? Through flyway management plans. Now, if you're not familiar with migratory birds, they're managed in flyways. So we're right here in the Mississippi Flyway, but there's the Pacific Flyway, the Central Flyway, the Mississippi Flyway, and the Atlantic Flyway. And those flyways make decisions about migratory birds. And so there were a lot of passionate people and biologists that said, hey, we want to restore trumpeter swans. They're part of our natural heritage. And they were also restored with the help of the Trumpeter Swan Society. So the Trumpeter Swan Society was founded in 1968, so about 52 years ago. And it was to bring together researchers and biologists because really nobody knew how to bring back a species. And it was all trial and error. And Dave was part of that. And it was really to share information about what works and doesn't work in terms of bringing back trumpeter swans. And our mission is to assure the vitality and welfare of wild trumpeter swans. So 2 years ago, we celebrated 50 years of trumpeter swan conservation. Now, I'm just bringing this up, not to brag, but a little bit to brag. Okay, these are some of the founding members of the Trumpeter Swan Society. So the people who founded the Trumpeter Swan Society were actually very well regarded. And some of them you may have heard about. Charles Bell was the president and chairman of General Mills. Walter Breckenridge, who was responsible for the James Ford Bell Museum of Natural History. Clarence Cotton, who was the former director of what's now the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And Peter Scott, who had started Slim Bridge in England, and he was very famous over there as well. So, what do trumpeter swans need? Well, they need clean, healthy wetlands for nesting. They are plant eaters, so they need submerged vegetation. They don't eat meat. They need safe migration routes, which means open water and food, and they also need open waters in the wintertime. North America, right now, if you were to see a swan, it would be one of 3 species. But only 2 species are actually native to North America. Now, many of you here have heard about the Tundra swan because it's really pretty important here with Tundra swans flying down the Mississippi River, stopping at Alma and heading on down. And we know that those migrations take place in the fall and then in the spring. And those Tundra swans nest and breed in the Arctic. And there are actually 2 populations of tundra swans. One of them that we see head out to the Chesapeake Bay, and the other one is the western population, and that goes to California and the Great Salt Lake Basin. But the other swan that we have is the trumpeter swan. So the 2 native swans are trumpeter and tundra. But back in the early 1900s, wealthy people wanted swans on their estates, on their ponds. So they brought in mute swans from England. And those are the queen swans. So how do you tell the difference? Well, the trumpeter swan has an all-black bill, and generally there's a V shape up here, and it's pretty straight here. Okay, and by the way, the trumpeter swan is the largest swan in the world. There's 7 species of swans, and it's one of the largest birds in North America. The tundra swan used to be called the whistling swan because of the sound that it makes. Now, tundra swans typically have yellow near their eye, and they're smaller. So this is a trumpeter swan cygnet, and a cygnet is a swan baby. So this trumpeter swan cygnet is about almost a year old, not quite. So you can see the size difference there. And then the mute swans, most people are familiar with those. Those have the orange bills. And again, those are from England. Well, this is the historic breeding area. So you kind of saw that map before. And today, with restoration efforts, these are where swans can be found. Now, I just want to say they're not evenly distributed over all these areas. Those are just sort of the boundaries of where you might see a swan. Well, as I already mentioned, the creek in South Dakota, they began the restoration of trumpeter swans to the Midwest. And they got cygnets from Red Rock Lakes. And those swans that were at La Creek National Wildlife Refuge in South Dakota, their descendants are now in South Dakota and Nebraska. And those birds are called the High Plains flock. So if you're by the Platte River Basin or whatever, those swans that you see are part of the High Plains flock. Well, Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and Iowa and Ohio decided to do something different. So I told you about the populations that were found in Alaska. The numbers were going down at Red Rock Lakes, and so they really didn't want to take any more swans from Red Rock Lakes. So Minnesota went first and decided they would actually fly up to Alaska and collect eggs. So this is actually the Wisconsin folks up in Alaska collecting eggs. And what they did is they went to this area of Alaska called the Minto Flats to collect the eggs. So each state was able to get 50 eggs per year, and they brought them back. And this is what the Minto Flats look like. So the swans that you see today, if they were descended from Alaska eggs that were collected, you know, they had the genetics from up here. And that's kind of important because it will feed into some of the issues that are going on with swans today. Well, if you grew up on a farm, you probably knew how to candle an egg. So when these biologists went out to these nests that were in these marshy areas, you know, they got out of the float plane and headed out, and they knew they wanted to only collect some of the eggs. They didn't want to take all of the eggs from the nest, so they candled the eggs, and they made sure that they left at least 3 eggs in the nest, and then they would put the others in these crates, all packed up. And originally they used hot water bottles, heaters to keep them warm. And later they actually had incubators that would keep the eggs warm. So Wisconsin the program began in 1987. When it really begins, it's really saying the state said, okay, let's go ahead and do it. So Wisconsin flew up to Alaska during 1989 to 1997, and they collected almost 400 eggs. So then what happened? So the eggs were brought back to the Milwaukee Zoo and hatched. Well then, again, when they hatch, the babies are called cygnets. So right away, half of the cygnets went up to a place kind of near us called Crex Meadows. I don't know if you've heard of it, but they went, again, this was learning how to do a swan restoration program. And so there was decoy rearing up at Crex Meadows. They wanted to see how that would work. And so those little babies imprinted on a big swan decoy, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison students went and they're pulling the decoy through the marshes, trying to get the little babies to follow them and learn how to feed. And so then there was a concern because they learned to fly in September, October, and these birds just weren't migrating. And it's just like, are they gonna go? Are they gonna go? And so finally, right before freeze up, they did go, and actually those first cygnets were later, they had collars on them, were later actually reported down in Texas. So the other 50% of the cygnets were actually captive rearing. It's really like GE and other businesses had ponds, and so those birds were raised till they were 2 years old and then released in different sites. So these were actually where trumpeter swans were released in Wisconsin. Here's Crex Meadows where the decoy rearing went on, and Necedah and some of these other areas where swans were released. The first wild pair in western Wisconsin was actually in Osceola. And soon, about 10 years after the program started, these are the most important nesting areas for Wisconsin trumpeter swans. They really need wetlands in marshy areas. So, the Minnesota restoration story. So actually, this is a copy of Dave's picture. And you can correct me, because I may not get this all correct. But Dave went out, as I mentioned, to Red Rock Lakes, and he brought back 20 adult swans from Red Rock Lakes, and he put them in Carver Park in what was then Hennepin County Park System. And this was the first pair that hatched cygnets, and these were the very first wild hatched cygnets that Minnesota had. And so Dave actually had this commissioned by a watercolor artist. So Minnesota, they released 2-year-old swans. Well, and this is Hennepin County Parks, and they actually had them all, you guys had them all fenced in as well at some of the preserves, right? So again, in the 70s, nobody knew how to do anything, and that's where the Trumpeter Swan Society with all these biologists were gathering information. In the 1980s, and the Minnesota DNR said, you know what? We want to move beyond the Twin Cities area. So they actually, with Carol Henderson from the Minnesota Non-Game, flew up to Alaska and collected eggs and brought them back. And again, the cygnets were reared at Carlos Avery State Wildlife Management Area near Forest Lake, and a lot of those 2-year-old cygnets were released at Tamarack by Detroit Lakes. And the zoos played an important role as well. Well, you know, restoration takes money. And so Carol Henderson, who's actually on our board, had these numbers. So Minnesota citizens, not through taxes, but through your checkoff on your state income tax, donated $500,000 that actually were used for the Trumpeter Swan restoration program in Minnesota. So you can kind of see those birds are valuable. You know, with an egg worth $400, a 4-year-old breeder, $8,000. Now, if you need a swan fix, you may or may not know this, but Monticello actually has a live swan cam. And you can actually, on our website, I actually have how you can get to it, but if you were to Google live swan cam at Monticello, you can see it, so you'll just click on that, and that is live from, I don't know, December through the end of February. So you'll see the swans flying in and flying out and fighting or whatever, so it's really kind of cool to do that. So as of 2015, this is sort of where the Midwest stands. So Minnesota had reported over 17,000 trumpeter swans, Wisconsin 4,700, but you get less and less and less. So Ohio only had 154. So sometimes Minnesota thinks everybody has 17,000, but they don't. So like even Iowa only has 200 swans. So just really quickly, what about the birds of the West? So just so you know, here we are. This is the interior population, which is Central, Mississippi, and Atlantic Flyway. The Pacific Coast Flyway, these are the birds that nest up here in Alaska, and they spend the winter right down here in Washington State and British Columbia. The other population is what's called the Rocky Mountain population, and this is our most vulnerable population that could wink out still. The Canadian portion is doing quite well, but here we have less than 1,000 birds, and their growth rate is only 6 swans per year. So we're working with Yellowstone National Park and the refuges out there to see what we can do to strengthen that. So in the Pacific Coast population, again here, the biggest issues here are declining winter habitat and lead poisoning. Yeah. As I had mentioned, the Rocky Mountain population is the most vulnerable. Just so you know, Yellowstone National Park used to have something like 84 swans in the 60s, and they're down to 2 nesting pair. Okay, and even those nesting pair don't nest every year, which means they don't have babies every year, so we're working with that. Okay, the Central Flyway, I'd mentioned, those are the birds that were descended from South Dakota. Well, because they all kind of came from those Red Rock Lake birds, and there were just a small number of them, one of our big concerns is genetic diversity. You know, it's how do you get where you have more genetics, more diverse genetics there. And in the Mississippi Flyway, where we are, our big issues here are health, swan health, and habitat. And we're also looking at, we're doing some research here as well, which I'll tell you a little bit about. And in the Atlantic Flyway, out on the East Coast, those states decided they didn't want to do trumpeter swan restoration because there's some tundra swan hunting out there. And they didn't want trumpeter swans to get there and then be accidentally shot by the tundra swan hunters, because there was a big fine if you accidentally shot a trumpeter swan. But so all these birds are pioneering birds. We don't know where they're coming from unless they have like a wing tag on them. And Ontario had its own restoration program. Harry Lumsden, who was on the Trumpeter Swan Society board for 20, 30 years, started it. He actually got Canada's highest award for his work bringing back trumpeter swans. So they put wing tags. These are actually cow ear tags on the wings here. And that's how you know where they're going. So these are reports of wing tag birds here. So there are continental issues as well. Trumpeter swans face, there's climate change, lack of migration tradition, power line collisions, and lead poisoning. Climate change, you know, as the climate dries out and gets hotter, wetlands will be disappearing. This is especially problematic in the Yukon and Alaska as the permafrost melts as well. It's going to affect that. Lack of migration traditions. So I told you that they went up to Alaska to collect those eggs. Well, when those birds came back, they didn't know how to migrate or where to migrate here because their genetics said, hey, we belong in Alaska. So all the birds that you see here they're pioneering birds. And we see them outside of Minnesota, Wisconsin. They had to learn how to go there. So we started a Trumpeter Watch program where people report where they're seeing birds in new areas. And so these are some of the places where we've gotten reports of trumpeter swans in new areas. Now back in the 90s, when Hennepin County Park was, and maybe this was a Minnesota bird, they put collars on the birds. And this was one of the early travels of one bird that had a collar that was reported back to Hennepin County Parks. But Minnesota stopped collaring a long time ago and really doesn't know very much about where its swans go. So now, this year, it just started, is this huge GPS tracking project that I'm hoping you might consider contributing to. They're putting GPS collars on swans in Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, and other states. And these are tracking. So these birds had collars put on them last summer. And so there's a public website that you can actually see them. So one of the swans is in Hudson, and another swan that has the GPS collars is in Monticello. And so it's pretty exciting what's happening with that. And this is actually what the GPS collars look like. Here's the one in Monticello. So the goal right now is to have at least 70 swans collared. Each collar costs about $1,500. It lasts 3 years, but it downloads data points every 15 minutes or so. It really helps biology people and swan managers learn where are they nesting, are they migrating through an area that's safe, does that area need protection, are they feeding in corn fields, what's happening with them, are they going back to their same nesting ground. So it's a really valuable project. The other issue is power line strikes. So trumpeter swans are huge birds. They're not very nimble. And if you're flying, sometimes when you're driving in the sun, and the sun's in your face, I mean, you can't really see the car in front of you or if something is going to go in front of you. Well, swans, it's the same way for swans. If they're flying into the sun, they don't see those power lines. And they're not nimble. So they can't really avoid them. So actually, here's a bird that hit a power line, and most of them are killed. And so one of the things that power companies are doing is they put these, what we call diverters, on there so that these big birds can actually see those lines. And so if you go to Monticello, when you're driving along 94, you'll see all these diverters there because that's telling you, one, there have been swan hits. Two, the power company cares about that because it costs money to do that. And it also tells you that that's an area of migration. So if you see those diverters, those are the things that tells you. So lead poisoning, okay, so we will get to some fun stuff, but this one is a very serious issue and it's something I feel very strongly about, and it's something the Trumpeter Swan Society feels very strongly about, so I'm gonna talk to you about that. This is called tip up. So swans eat food on the bottom of the river or the lake or the wetland. So they use their bills and they pull up submerged vegetation like roots or tubers or whatever. And so they're reaching down into the bottom to eat, and that's called tip up. Well, 3 of our, what we call charismatic species, these are birds that people love and care about, are actually impacted by lead poisoning. There's the eagle, the trumpeter swan, and the common loon. So one of the things that I did here in the St. Croix watershed was to have a partnership with Crex Meadows, Loon Watch, and the Trumpeter Swan Society to see if we could bring attention to lead poisoning for these 3 charismatic species. So some of you may know about this, some of you may not. Sometimes hunters will say, hey, lead shot was banned in 1991. Yes, it was. And part of the reason for that is this is actually the lead-related deaths prior to that happening. And so annual losses from lead poisoning were estimated between 1.6 and 2.4 million waterfowl each year from lead poisoning, lead pellets usually. And there are a number of birds that are affected by lead poisoning. You don't need to know all these things, but just telling you it's not just a swan, it's not just a loon, it's not just an eagle. It's 25 species actually are affected by lead poisoning. Well, sometimes hunters know about pellets, but fishermen don't know about lead sinkers or split shot. And lead fishing tackle is a huge issue. And this is actually a cleanup in Washington State. Now, you may not know this, but in this gravel up here are sinkers. And sometimes people think, well, why doesn't that bird just see it, and avoid it? Well, they can't tell. For them, it's just grit. And their digestive system is different than ours. So they, just like chickens, they collect pebbles or stones or whatever as grit, and it's in their gizzard, and that's what they use to grind down the food. Well, if they have a lead thing, whether it's a sinker, split shot, or pellets, that lead gets ground down, and then that goes into their bloodstream. They can't defecate it, they can't get rid of that, it's in their body, and it continues to go to all their organs. So we are trying to bring awareness to that. So actually, a graphic designer from the St. Croix watershed designed this for us where lead kills. Now I had mentioned, this is just to kind of give you an idea of this. Out in Washington State, I told you about the declining winter habitat. Well, for more than 20 years, the Trumpeter Swan Society has worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to monitor swan deaths. That area of Washington in British Columbia is the most important wintering area for trumpeter swans on that whole west coast. And just this year since December, in 8 counties, there have been 307 deaths of swans collected, and 178 of them were from lead poisoning. How do we know that? Those gizzards are sent to the Canadian Wildlife Service, and they're analyzed for what's in it, what's causing that. Closer to home, this week, maybe you guys saw this, okay? More than a dozen swans have died at a Twin Cities lake near Vadnais Heights. And this talks about how they picked it up, and that's probably lead sinkers because it's a heavily fished lake. Well, over there, I have something. If you live in Minnesota, I hope you will take it. This is from Carol Henderson. Again, he's on our board. He led the Minnesota non-game section. Minnesota DNR did a study on lead poisoning as it relates to loons. And this study in 2003 estimated that Minnesota anglers lose an average of 1 sinker per day. And so most people think, well, one, it's just idea of, it's just a little drop. Well, all those things matter. So they estimated that with all the sinkers lost, it's about 300 tons per year of lead sinkers and fishing tackle are deposited on Minnesota lakes. Well, that doesn't disappear. That doesn't dissolve, okay? And the cost to switch is really, nothing. So it's estimated that anglers spent $275 per year on lead sinkers, and the Fish and Wildlife Service estimated in 2011, Minnesota anglers spend an average of $473 a year on fishing equipment. So making a switch is nothing. And it's just really important to do. And just so you know, the same study estimates that Minnesota loses 200 to 300 common loons per year from lead poisoning. How do we know that? Those loons are sent to Madison, Wisconsin for necropsy, and that's how they know what caused it. So is lead an issue? Yes, it is. So how do you recognize? I want to get through this. Again, we'll have some fun stuff, but I think this is so important. There's stuff that I hope you would do. When birds are sick, they isolate themselves. So here's a swan with lead poisoning. You can see the drooping wings. Here are the healthy swans right here. So just like if you're sick, you just want to go to your bed, close the door, not have anybody bother you. When animals are sick, they isolate themselves as well. So generally you can tell, well, they'll have the drooping wings, but also their tail down here, it's not upraised. So you see how these are healthy swans. See how that tail goes up? What happens with lead poisoning, lead affects the muscular system. Okay, it's where they begin to lose the ability to move their muscles. This is green bile that was vomited. They also have green diarrhea. This is actually a gizzard where you can see the fishing equipment right in there. These are healthy swans. This is all up on the St. Croix, by the way. These are local swans. What lead does also, I told you, affects the muscles. It also affects the smooth muscles, which means that their smooth muscles don't work to digest their food, and so they starve. All this happens over the 2 to 3 week period. It's all preventable. So there's impaired flying. Again, this is on the St. Croix River. They don't move for a long period of time. That's one way to recognize it. And they also, what lead does is it causes them to not be able to regulate their body temperature. So we will find them frozen on the ice. They can't move. Just as you hear about with kids with lead poisoning, it affects their brains. Well, swans and animals also get neurological damage. Another thing that we see is repeated head shaking that goes on. There's also gasping for air, tremors, and they can't hold up their head. Sometimes people say, hey, how do you know it's from lead? And so the Minnesota Wildlife Rehab Center does radiograms. Here's the lead sinker right here. Well, generally, by the time a bird is weak enough to capture, the lead is so much through their body that there's really very little hope of recovery. So about 95% of them will die if they're taken to the rehab center. Then, here's a dead cygnet here, and the eagles are feeding it on it. It moves up the food chain, again on the St. Croix River. So, what can you do? If you fish, please, please, please switch to non-lead tackle. And buy non-lead ammunition as well. That handout that I told you about, this is just so you know this. How many of you live in Minnesota? Okay, pick it up. On the handout, Minnesota was, I don't know if I forget how many millions of dollars it was for the BP oil remediation. A portion of that was to be used by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency for education for the general public about the dangers of lead and loons. And part of that would involve a lead tackle exchange. Well, 4 legislators said no to that money being spent that way. Their contact information is on that sheet that I told you about. That was written by Carol Henderson. He feels very strongly about this, that you can help raise your voice to let those 4 folks know that you want them to have, as that money was allocated to be spent that way by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, they should honor that and do that. So spread the word. Again, we have these decals. Be responsible, recreation. And also on our website, we have a list of non-toxic tackle suppliers. You can just download that as well. All right, so getting off the death, I'm going to go into some other things so you can do before we get into Swan 101. One of the things I talked about with Israel, and I think it was important for the Prescott School District, is education is something that you all can participate in as well, certainly by the school district. There's a federal junior duck stamp contest, and I already told Israel about the DVD. So the junior duck stamp contest is really pretty cool. So nearly 25,000 students participate. And just so you know, there's a 4-part curriculum guide that can be used by the students. And so what this curriculum guide does is it talks about conservation, but it uses math and science and literature and art. And then there's the culmination with drawing as well as conservation messages. And if you're an educator, this is the junior duck stamp screenshot, so you can see what they have here. It's a really cool thing to do to raise awareness about wildlife conservation with kids. And these are just some of the, there's a traveling show of all the winners of the junior duck stamp contest. It's from kindergarten through grade 12. So that's really cool too. So I'd taken that was up at Tamarack National Wildlife Refuge Center. Get involved. Well, maybe you want to help us fund a collar to help us find out where do Minnesota and Wisconsin swans go. You know, $10, $25, $50, $100, whatever. It's on our website. You can make a donation. The more swans we can collar, the more we can learn where they're going and what we can do to help protect them. Keep wildlife safe. Switch to non-lead. And as I already mentioned that, you know, if you live in Minnesota, get that handout. And be informed. So I had that list over there for you to sign up if you want to get our e-newsletter. And just so you know, I was telling some of you, we have these limited sales for Swan shirts, but they're only get them through e-news. It's a limited time offer. They're usually like only 3 weeks. Invest in conservation. Invest in the values that you care about nature. You can join the Trumpeter Swan Society. You can purchase federal duck stamps. You don't have to hunt to purchase us. That's actually America's longest running art competition. They're only $25. 98% of those proceeds go for conservation projects all across North America. The junior duck stamp is only $5, and then that supports environmental education for all the schools and students who participate in that. And if there's a conservation initiative here, participate in it. Anybody that signs up that lives in Wisconsin, I will send you notices about the Wisconsin Conservation Congress meetings that have issues that might be related to wetland conservation. So, okay, so enough of the informative stuff. Let's get into the Trumpeter Swan 101. So, Trumpeter swans have a wingspan of 7 to 8 feet. They can weigh anywhere between 21 and 30 pounds. And it's difficult to tell the male from the female. And you'd be surprised how many people say, oh, it's the one with the skinny neck, or it's a bigger bird, or something. You can't tell what it is. So sometimes even biologists, even if they look at the cloacal area, still need a blood test done to actually determine what the sex of that swan is. Generally, the male, who's called a cob, does tend to weigh more than the female, but not always. One way to tell, too, is usually the female will be on the nest, and the male will patrol. So generally, it's the female who nests, is on the nest. So it takes them about 4 to 6 years before they're sexually mature enough to breed, and they're also indicators of healthy wetlands. And their nests are former muskrat or beaver mounds, but they can also build their own with rushes and things like that. So they don't nest in trees. They nest in wetlands on the water. And they tend to like islands because this way they can watch out for predators that might be going around the nest as well. They do mate for life, but there are exceptions. If a mate dies, they will remate. There are instances of what you might consider divorce. So if a pair tries for 5 or 6 years to have cygnets or to nest just mean lay eggs, and they're unsuccessful, generally they will part ways and find another mate because their overriding goal is procreation. They are faithful to their nesting areas, which means they come back. If they're successful raising a brood on a certain nest area, marsh area, they will return to that and they'll defend that as well. When they come back in the spring, usually March, April, if they have the cygnets from the previous year, from that previous year with them, when they all get back, the parents want to get another brood, so they kick those kids out. It's just like you're on your own. The incubation period for the eggs are about 34 days, so 32 to 37 days. And they're huge eggs, so they're about 3 times the size of a chicken egg. Cygnets weigh about half a pound at hatch, but they grow rapidly. And they do that by eating invertebrates. So their necks are really scrawny and little. They can't reach down into the sediment. So their parents, which you'll see in the thing, their parents stir up food, and then they eat the invertebrates for protein, and that's how they grow. So the average brood size is 3 to 6 cygnets. There is a high death rate. So about 50% of the cygnets will die between hatch and when they learn to fledge, which means to fly. And they might be eaten by a snapping turtle, maybe a mink. Sometimes eagles will come down, it's just like these delicate little morsels kind of a thing. So they lose about 50% of the cygnets before fledge. And then another 25% will die either from powerline collisions or lead poisoning or something before they reach 3 to 4 years old, before they're old enough to breed. So you lose about 75% of the swans that are hatched before they reach breeding age. But once they reach 4 years old, then they're pretty good, unless they hit a powerline or lean. They molt in usually July, August, which means they can't fly. And that's where they get new feathers. And it takes a long time for the cygnets to learn to fly, so they might hatch in late May, June, but they don't learn to fly till September. And so they're pretty awkward flyers. That's another time of high mortality for cygnets, especially if they're power lines around the perimeter of their wetland. So it's a high time of high mortality. And then they spend the winter with their parents. So they spend the first year with their parents, and they imprint on their wintering site. Now this is what we think. We'll know more once the study with the collars is done. So that's where they learn to winter from, where their parents take them. And so the cygnets stay gray for their first year, and they stay with their parents the first year. Now, trumpeter swans go back to their nesting grounds even while snow and ice is still on the ground. So they might go back in March, April, and they're there defending their territory. If they have a good territory that they've raised cygnets on before, they want to keep that territory. So they go back because they want to defend that. And it's during the second summer that when cygnets molt, that's when they turn white. But after they turn white, you have no clue how old a bird is. Okay, you just can't tell. So they're called different names. Biologists call them subadults. Some people call them juveniles. They're generally like adolescents. They're not mature enough to breed, and they generally hang out with other young, white swans that are not old enough to breed. So actually, near New Richmond, I got a call from a guy who said, oh, it's summer and there are like 30 trumpeter swans here on my lake. It's just like, well, that's different, because normally it should be nesting. Well, these are all subadults or young white swans. They're all hanging out together on this lake near New Richmond. So what do they eat? Well, mostly pondweed and submerged vegetation, and then obviously the invertebrates as well for the young ones. How old can they live? Well, the oldest one in Wisconsin lived up to 30 years. Okay, generally in the wild, a swan will live between 15 and 20 years once they get over that hump of the first 3 years. So where can you see swans? Well, if you live in Monticello, you probably, if you live in Minnesota, Monticello is the place to go. And I already told you about the swan camp. Tamarack National Wildlife Refuge, which is near Detroit Lakes. Eastman Nature Center, which is part of Three Rivers Park District. Lake Camelot, which is in Plymouth. There are lots of different places to see swans. Here in Wisconsin, there's Creeks Meadows. And so if you go, they have all kinds of marshy areas where you can see nesting trumpeter swans. In the wintertime, Hudson is a good place. Obviously down here is another good place. These are just some of the areas where, on the Apple River is another place where people can see trumpeter swans. Well, just to give a little plug, next weekend I'm going to be giving a talk at the Hudson Public Library. It's going to be much shorter than this, but we're going to watch the DVD of Wisconsin Restoration Story, and then we're going to walk along the St. Croix, and we're going to see the swans. And as I see behavior, I'll point that out, like what it means and what they're doing. Now, if you like to travel, Iowa does swan releases in May, and hundreds of school kids come to that. And I do have a little video of the swan release there, but every person that goes to that can actually touch and feel a swan up close. So it's used, Iowa has this fabulous program for wetland education. So they release these swans on these selected wetlands. And like I said, hundreds of school kids come and they talk about wetlands. The zoos are there to talk about what they do, and everybody has a chance to do that. And then they're all around the area, and the kids are lined up, and then they release this. There's a countdown, like 10, 9, 8, whatever, and then the cygnets are released. So you'll see a little. It's just so much fun. And then there'll be a swan festival there this year as well. So if you sign up for our e-newsletter, you will get a notice about that. So it's Thursday, Friday, and Saturday.
Where is that?
It'll be in southern Iowa. Okay, so we'll do the videos right now. We'll see how this works. These are all very short, less than a minute. Most are like 30 seconds or less.
We have a highly sophisticated system here.
I think they were down here, weren't they? Okay, we'll just start from. We'll start from. Okay, so these are very quiet. So swans don't make a lot of noise in the wetlands. So, but this one, I just want to show you how cute this is. These are this little family. You'll see them wave their little wings. So it's just very peaceful and quiet. It's just so wonderful just to go and see these things. Okay. That must have been it, right? Did that? Yep, hit the next one. All right. So here's a cygnet right here, but you'll watch these parents rocking back and forth. They're stirring up the bottom with their feet to dislodge the food so that the cygnets, it'll rise to the surface here. But this is also a way, in case there's lead down in there, that's where they stir it up as well, which makes it easier for swans to get that. So here are the other little ones. They're about a month old, so they're coming to. See how peaceful it is? Isn't it just really relaxing? What's this next one? Okay, so swan talk. Okay. That's the trumpeting sound. Now it's going to land here. Now there's going to be a little fight here. So they're going to be doing some pair bonding. So they all have to have their say. I mean, it gets really raucous and loud. And that murmuring, those are the non-dominant birds, those quieter birds. Okay, what's the next one? Okay, this is just kind of showing, like, people say, how do I know? When they don't fly off until all of them that want to leave. They live in family groups. This is how you know that they're going to take off. And then and they might go on forever doing that, but then you'll see they'll do this S curve, okay? There. That's how you know you get your camera ready, okay? That's how you'll know to take a picture. When you see that S curve, there's no going back. It's in Hudson. What's the next one? Okay. All right, so all is quiet on the western front here. This looks all very peaceful. This, again, in Hudson. Peacefully gliding by. You can see the rapid water here. That's a cygnet. You can tell by the gray. This is actually where a beaver had come down. Now, there's a pecking order, okay? So the dominant family, even the cygnets, will dominate over another adult, okay? So that's a cygnet chasing a cygnet. Now, watch this. Okay, so that's a dominant, that's from a dominant family. And they don't get hurt, by the way. It doesn't hurt them. Generally, after something like this, they'll do a triumph display. See, that's a triumph display. And then that one will do, hey, it's okay, I'm still okay, kind of a thing. Okay. All right. Here, if you listen carefully, you'll hear Tundra swans. That that's a tundra. You heard that? That's how you can tell as well. So there's one Tundra swan there. I don't know where it is. You can hear it. And that's the sound of birds coming in from over here. Here they come. They always greet each other. I mean, when swans come in, they all greet each other. Okay, so it's very peaceful here. What's going to happen here is you're going to see a family will take off, but the parents are in front, and then you'll see the cygnets come up quickly from behind. So they always leave. There's the parents. This is another pair because it's going to decide it's not going to go. Okay, so they're doing that pre-flight communication, and here are their cygnets that are coming. So the parents are going, come on, come on. So, okay, so there's the S curve, and now they're all leaving. So, I mean, that's important. So you can always tell then how many cygnets are with the family is they all leave in a family group. All quiet now again on the western front. All quiet. Okay. They're feeding there. Okay, okay, so this is what you see. All right, so this is going to be some pair bonding and some chasing. So here's a pair right here where they bump each other. I mean, that's pair bonding behavior. That's where they strengthen their pair bonds, where they come together and bump their chests and they do the heart. Okay. Now, these birds right here want to have a dispute with other swans. So, now they're still doing their pair bonding thing, okay? But these birds right here, and later, I didn't get this on my camera, but then they went off and had a fight. Okay, this is funny. Okay, so these are a couple of families that are having a dispute. This is that whole pecking order thing. Well, if they're siblings from a previous year, they come out to actually join the core family. So this is icy here. It's kind of that wet ice. And okay. Okay. So I mean, it's a lot of fuss and bother for like a minute or something, and then it all kind of comes out. We had a teacher, one of our members of the teacher side, says, "Oh, that reminds me when I was a teacher, I used to go out on the playground and try to break the kids up from having a fight." Okay, I want to tell you about this after you see it. So, okay, this is one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. So the swan on the ice wasn't able to fly off. I think it was sick. And it was calling and calling, and its mate had flown off earlier. Well, she kept calling it, and that's where it just flew back. And they spent the night together. When I came back the next morning, they were gone. I was hoping that, you know, it all was well. But this kind of shows the loyalty that they have to each other. Okay, what's the next one? Probably one more. Okay, so this will be, yeah, so this is, if you listen carefully, hear the sound of them. So they're going to take off. You hear that? It's very particular to trumpeter swans when they take. Okay, so then we'll go back to my, but see, aren't they fun to watch? Okay, so that's why, you know, if you go to Monticello, you'll see them. If you look at that live cam, you'll see some of that behavior. What's the next one? Okay, so one of the gifts that all the people who've worked to restore swans have really given the next generation is something which is really connecting us with our past. So John James Audubon in the 1800s saw trumpeter swans. Now remember, 30 years later, they were completely wiped out from all North America except for 69. So he wrote about, when they were still around, he wrote about this, and he was watching them bathe. And he goes, now with an extended scooping movement, the head becomes immersed for a moment, and with a sudden effort, a flood of water is thrown over the back and wings, when it is seen rolling off in sparkling globules, like so many large pearls. The bird then shakes its wings, beats the water, and as if giddy with delight, shoots away, gliding over and beneath the surface of the liquid element with surprising agility and grace. Imagine, reader, that a flock of 50 swans are thus sporting before you, as they have more than once been in my sight, and you will feel, as I have felt, more happy and void of care than I can describe. So, with the return of the trumpeter swan and all those people who made it happen, they're giving you, your children, and your great-grandchildren that same opportunity that John James Audubon had experienced and wrote about. And I'm hoping that you will also support Trumpeter Swan Conservation. We're a nonprofit. And so thank you, and any questions? Yes?
Has there been an attempt to legislate banning the lead fishing tackle?
Yes, and it was defeated.
How long ago was that?
Just recently, in the last 6 months. Now, just so you know, Wisconsin, for the last in the last 5 years, has tried to ban lead fishing tackle under half an ounce. And again, it's through this Conservation Congress, these spring meetings, these spring hearings, and that went down in flames. I mean, basically people said, it's fine with us to have lead fishing tackle. And the lead ammunition almost made it where it was going to be banned. But I know, and Carol Henderson has said this too, it's the fishing community that is unaware of what lead fishing tackle does, which is why we need your help getting the word out. Because if people say, hey, I don't know about it, it's not a problem, they're not going to say, hey, I want to have the change. So that's why this whole Minnesota lead tackle exchange would have been really great if it would be approved. And I don't know if it was 1.2 million. I forget. I don't know. Carol has it on there, but it would really help raise awareness in a big way to the issue. So, yes.
What about wind farms?
Right now, those are not an issue. I don't know if Trumpeter Swans see those. So, power lines that are that the power goes from the wind farms, those are issues, but the turbines themselves are not an issue. Swans don't hit those. Yes?
So one of the swans was mute swan, right? And you say it's an invasive species?
Yes.
Why?
Why is it invasive? Well, first of all, it belongs in Europe because it's a Eurasian species, but what they found is that it actually tears up the bottom of the wetlands like significantly more than like a tundra or a trumpeter swan would. And so that's destroying also the habitat for other waterfowl. So there are states that have mute swan removal programs, including Maryland, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin had one as well, and Minnesota also removes mute swans. So, yeah.
Once they get that lead poisoning, if you catch them soon enough, will they get well?
Could you repeat that question?
Okay, yeah. So she asked if they catch a bird with lead poisoning soon enough, will they get well? Yes. Well, first of all, just so you know, the way they treat lead poisoning is through chelation therapy. So they inject the bird with some chemicals to help chelate the lead so that they can excrete it. And that can take several months. One of the issues is, will that bird have neurological impairment where it won't be able to fly correctly or whatever? So out in Washington State, they're very proud that if they can release 5 swans that had lead poisoning that they've treated. Generally, at the Minnesota Wildlife Rehab Center, when they get a bird with lead poisoning, they do a blood test. And if they feel that it's at a certain level, it's better to put the bird down rather than having it suffer and go through these months and months of therapy. Yeah. Yes?
I have a couple questions, but so the GPS collar, is there, if we donate for that, can we find out the track of
Yep.
the birds?
Yes. So if you don't, and it's on our homepage where it says Trumpeter Tracking Project, but then we have a link right now to that website, so it's under current research projects. But this way, I'll also, again, if you sign, anybody that donates, they'll also get the links to that website. So every, 4 or 5 days, they upload the location. So this is being done, the map is being done through the University of Minnesota PhD student who's doing that. So yes, that's public information, and one of the goals is to see if students and teachers can actually use that for environmental education as well. So, yep.
Did the Tundra swans experience the same population decline as the trumpeters? And
No.
Not why?
No. Okay, so Tundra swans nest up in the Arctic, and then they would fly down to the Chesapeake or the Great Salt Lake, but then they would go back to the Arctic to nest. So generally, if there was any hunting, it would have to be during the time that they were down at the Chesapeake area, in these smaller areas. And what it is right now is with tundras, if there's tundra swan hunting, you have to have a permit. There are only so many tundra swans that are permitted to be hunted. Trumpeter swans nested throughout the entire, Midwest and whatever, so they're a lot easier to shoot and kill. So Dave Hoffman from the Iowa DNR, when he tells kids, he says, so if you're a pioneer family and you're looking for food and you see a big bird, what are you going to shoot to feed your family or to have feathers for your pillows or whatever? So generally they were wiped out one by one, the families, because they nest in areas and they shot them in those areas. Yes? Does she have a question?
So do the collars that they wear, do they ever get too tired or do they ever freeze?
No, the collars are actually very lightweight. I forgot to bring one. And actually those GPS collars are extremely lightweight. So once in a great while, for other collars that are plastic, sometimes in the very cold weather, you might get some ice on it that could build up. And there were some problems with that. But generally, once the water, they dip their head in and the water's warm enough, the ice will melt. So I think Minnesota had some problems initially with icing on the collars. But I've seen icing on the collar in Hudson, and it's not detrimental because it hasn't actually gotten that cold to have really thick ice on it. So, yes?
I've got two questions. I've seen swans with, who's tagging the swans on the legs? Because I've seen some birds that have gotten late.
Okay, so the U.S., I'm sorry. So she's asking who tags the swans if there's something on the leg. So if a bird gets a collar, the state puts the collar on. And by the way, Wisconsin stopped doing that 10 to 12 years or so ago. Minnesota stopped it like years ago, and Iowa just stopped it a couple years ago. The state puts the plastic collar with the number on it. The Fish and Wildlife Service has the metal band that goes on the leg, and that's so that the metal is a Fish and Wildlife Service band.
Do they get them when they're signets, or what's the process for when they tag them?
Generally, what they've done is they've done it when they're just about ready to learn to fly. So when they're about 3 to 4 months old, they're almost as big as parents, and they haven't learned to fly yet. So generally when Wisconsin was doing that, they would do it, they would capture them and put collars on them just before they learned how to fly. So, okay, yes?
When they have the sub-adult gatherings, is it both female and male?
Sure, yep.
And then do you know the minimal size of a wetland for swans to nest?
Yeah, generally the biology people are saying about 3 acres would be sort of a minimum. And just so you know, on our website we have instructions for how to make your wetland attractive to trumpeter swans. Did she have a question?
When I look at a map about trumpeter swans and their migration, do they go to warm places in the south? Or what is their range?
Okay.
The trumpeter swans. Because it seems like they need things very cold, but they survive in warm climates.
Yes, that's a great question, actually. So when Wisconsin was first doing its restoration, that was one of the studies that they did, is how far are Wisconsin swans migrating during the winter? And this is very early on, and the study said, hey, they're migrating anywhere from 50 to 200 miles. Well, we now have Wisconsin swans being reported, and they have for several years, down in Missouri, where the Mississippi enters and the Missouri meet at the confluence there of those two. And I just got back this past weekend from Heber Springs, Arkansas, which is a little bit north of Little Rock. And Heber Springs, Arkansas has about 350 to 40 trumpeter swans that winter there. They love it. And those birds originally came from a Hennepin County park trumpeter swan being blown off course in the late 80s or early 90s and finding its way to Heber Springs. There's all these wetlands there, okay? And it found its way to this little lake on an oxbow called Magnus Lake. And there was a guy there that actually had decoys and whatever, and he fed them. And it was very exciting for Arkansas. Well, then the next year, that bird came back with more of its family, and more and more and more. So right now, like I said, there are about 350 to 400 swans there. They generally leave to come back north around Valentine's Day. Now, we know that Wisconsin swans have shown up there because Wisconsin had yellow collars. So Wisconsin yellow-collared birds are there. We were also doing this study with Iowa. It's called Track a Trumpeter, where there were GPS collars put on Iowa cygnets. Okay, they wanted to find out where these cygnets were going. Well, unfortunately, one of the GPS locator things actually fell off the collar, but the bird showed up with its family at Heber Springs with this gray collar on. And I got a call from Arkansas Department of Fish and Game, and they said, we got this strange bird down here. What is this thing on its neck? Well, I had gone to Iowa to see these birds, because we're helping to fund that, to see these birds getting the collar on it, and I recognized the collar. And so fortunately, there was a guy there with a long camera lens who actually took a zoom picture of the inside of the collar, which said Iowa State University, whatever. And so we know that that Iowa swan, which was near probably central Iowa, showed up in Heber Springs, Arkansas, with its family, but we have no clue where it stopped along the way because it lost its GPS transmitter. So Iowa did go back to that same family to put another collar on that family. So we're hoping, if we get enough money, that we want to collar at least one swan down there in Heber Springs to see where it's going, because we have no clue. This was the first year they didn't have any swan with a collar on it, the very first year. So it's just like, okay, so where are these birds coming from? They had to come from Minnesota, Iowa, or Michigan or Wisconsin, because that's where the restoration program started. But that's one of the wonderful things that can happen with this GPS tracking thing, is we can find out where are they going, where are they staying, where are they feeding, where are they stopping, that type of thing. So they love the winter. Trumpeter swans have actually been reported in Texas and in Oklahoma. Virginia gets quite a few of the Ontario swans, and we had a sighting from North Carolina's Outer Banks last year. So they like the warmth, but they nest up north. So, yes.
Don't a lot of them still stay in the northern area as long as they can find open water rather than migrate, since they don't have the migration genes?
Well, again, what we're finding, if you actually go to eBird maps, we actually have now where if you sign up for eNews, you'll get the maps. We actually have where swans have been seen during different swan seasons of the year. So you'll see they're down in southern Illinois. But
there's still a lot found in Monticello. There's a big...
But those are wintering swans. Those are wintering swans there.
That's what I mean.
Right. So
they don't migrate.
Well, and again, we don't really know where those birds are coming from for Monticello. So Minnesota tends to think that their Minnesota birds stay in Minnesota, and that's where, there's no fence around Minnesota. So that's why we want to have that collaring thing as well, to see. Now, yes, they do. There are a lot of them that stay here in the wintertime, but more and more are going south as well, as they're finding.
They're learning migratory habits.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So,
could we take one more question?
Okay, just one more question if there's, yes.
I think earlier in the presentation you mentioned that genetic diversity is important for the birds. How do they achieve this if the same group of swans move to south and then come back, or they stay in like Minnesota?
Okay, I'm not quite sure I understood the question. So you're wondering how they find their way back?
No, the genetic diversity.
Oh, the genetic diversity, right. So the Nebraska and South Dakota swans pretty much stay in Nebraska and South Dakota. there aren't that many birds, just so you know, so there aren't that many. And the biology people are saying, well, you know, those birds are coming from Minnesota and Iowa on the east part. Eventually they'll make their way to the western part of Nebraska to meet up. But that's one thing we're looking at is, well, how many years is that going to take? And can we move any, like, Minnesota eggs or birds to Nebraska to see if we can get that genetic diversity. But all that takes process, you know, Fish and Wildlife Service and the states and, you know, all this stuff. So there's a big process for doing that. So thank you very much. I really appreciate being here and talking about trumpeter swans.
Well, what a treat. It's super exciting to have Margaret back here in Prescott with us, and thank you all for joining us. Again, my name is Israel Haas. I'm the Executive Director for the Great River Road Visitor and Learning Center at Freedom Park. And just show of hands, how many of you have been to Freedom Park? Hey, good. All right. For those of you who haven't, check us out sometime, visit us, and friend us on Facebook. We want to keep you informed about all the other opportunities. And this, of course, like all of our programs, is due to the generosity of individuals just like you guys. So we'd love to connect with you. We're a nonprofit organization that partners with the city to provide that opportunity. So visit, stay around, feel free. We still have a few cookies. Somebody needs to eat those. I'm not taking them home. And Margaret will be over at the table here. Be sure to ask any other questions of her before you take off today.
Great.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Margaret, here for a book.
Oh, thank you.
Great to
Okay.
see you
Yeah.
again.
Nice.